What if the people who forgive the most are also the ones who eventually reach a point where they never forgive the same way again? Most people think empaths always forgive. They believe patience is endless and understanding has no limits. That no matter how many times they are hurt, they will always return with the same softness, the same effort, the same emotional availability. But that belief misses something important. There is a hidden limit no one notices. A point that doesn't come with drama or confrontation. No arguments, no final warning, no emotional explosion. Instead, a quiet emotional shift happens long before anything on the outside looks different. It is so subtle that even the people closest to them don't see it forming. The moment an empath stops caring, everything changes internally. Not in a loud way, not in a sudden way, but in a slow and silent collapse of emotional investment. They don't become cold overnight. They don't suddenly turn distant without reason. They become emotionally detached, step by step, moment by moment, after repeated emotional exhaustion. And here is the core idea you need to understand. When an empath stops caring, it is not anger. It is emotional finality. In this video, you are going to learn something most people never realize until it is too late. You will understand why empaths care so deeply in the first place, why they stay longer than they should in situations that drain them emotionally, and what exactly happens inside them when that emotional patience finally runs out. We will break down the silent stages of emotional withdrawal, the subtle behaviors that appear before detachment becomes obvious, and the psychological turning point where communication stops turning into connection. You will also see why this shift is almost always misunderstood by others, who assume everything is still fine, simply because nothing has been said out loud. Because this is not just about relationships becoming distant. It is about the moment emotional effort stops being rewarded and starts being replaced with exhaustion. It is about what happens when someone who feels everything deeply finally decides that feeling more is no longer worth the cost. And if you stay until the end, you will understand something powerful. That when an empath stops caring, it rarely looks like an ending at first. But internally, it already is. And by the time people realize it, the emotional distance has already been completed in silence. But this moment does not happen overnight. It builds slowly. Welcome to Mental Dynamics, where we explore the hidden psychology of human behavior, emotional intelligence, and relationship dynamics in a way that helps you see people, emotions, and yourself more clearly. If you find value in understanding what is usually left unspoken, make sure to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community. Empaths are often misunderstood because their emotional world is not simple. It is deep, layered, and constantly active. They do not just feel their own emotions, they experience the emotional weight of people around them as well. It is as if their mind is always tuned into signals that others ignore. They feel emotions deeply and constantly. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way that shapes how they see people and relationships. When someone around them is hurting, they don't just notice it, they feel pulled into it, as if that pain becomes partially their responsibility. This is why they connect so strongly with people's pain. They don't respond with judgment first, they respond with understanding. Even when something is wrong, they try to see what caused it, what led to it, what emotional struggle might be hidden underneath it. And because of this, they tend to over-invest in relationships. They give more attention, more care, more emotional presence than they receive in return. They try to stabilize emotional imbalance by giving more of themselves, believing that effort can eventually create harmony. They forgive quickly, sometimes too quickly. Not because they forget pain, but because they prioritize emotional peace over emotional conflict. They believe holding on to resentment creates distance, so they release it faster than most people would. And they stay emotionally available for long periods, even when situations become inconsistent or draining, because their emotional system is built on understanding, not withdrawal. But this strength, as powerful as it is, slowly becomes a burden over time. Because when one person is constantly giving emotional energy and the response is not equal, imbalance begins to form. At first it is small, almost unnoticeable. A conversation that feels slightly one-sided. A moment of care that is not fully acknowledged. A feeling that is gently dismissed instead of understood. They adjust. They adapt. They maintain peace even when something feels off. And over time, this becomes a pattern. One-sided emotional effort begins to define the dynamic. They are the ones checking in. They are the ones repairing misunderstandings. They are the ones trying to keep emotional balance alive, but their care is not matched in the same depth. Their feelings are sometimes ignored, sometimes minimized, sometimes postponed as if they can be dealt with later. And because empaths are patient, they tolerate more than they should without realizing the long-term impact. They keep adjusting themselves to maintain peace in the relationship. Not because they want control, but because they want connection. They want understanding. They want emotional stability. But emotional imbalance becomes normal over time if it is not addressed. And that normalization is what creates confusion later. Because when something unhealthy becomes familiar, it stops feeling alarming. It starts feeling like something that just is. But deep down, the body and mind begin to register something different. A quiet form of exhaustion that doesn't come from one event, but from repeated emotional effort that is never fully returned. And this is where the shift begins. The breaking point does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. Instead, it starts with small behavioral changes that seem insignificant at first. They stop over-explaining small things. Things they would normally clarify, they now leave unsaid. Not out of anger, but out of realization that explaining does not always lead to understanding. They reduce emotional expression, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying more feels unnecessary when it no longer changes outcomes. They begin observing more than reacting. Instead of immediately responding emotionally, they step back mentally and watch patterns. They listen more than they speak, not because they are passive, but because they are processing differently now. Conversations start to feel heavier, not because the topics change, but because emotional energy behind them is no longer the same. What once felt natural now feels like effort. And without even realizing it, emotional energy starts to withdraw. This withdrawal is extremely subtle. From the outside, everything still looks normal. They still reply. They still engage. They still show up. But internally, something is slowly stepping back. And this is the part most people never notice. Because they assume the empath will always return to their emotional baseline. That patience will reset. That understanding will continue as before. That silence or distance is temporary. Past forgiveness creates false emotional security. Because when someone has been forgiven repeatedly, they begin to assume forgiveness is part of the pattern. They believe emotional distance is just a phase, not a shift. So they ignore early signals. They continue the same behavior. They assume nothing significant is changing. But what they don't see is that emotional withdrawal is already in progress. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes irreversible. Because at some point, the empath reaches a stage where emotional responses become neutral. Things that once triggered emotional reaction no longer do. Situations that once required explanation no longer feel worth explaining. Conversations that once carried emotional weight now feel distant. They stop chasing understanding. Not because they don't care at all, but because they no longer believe chasing will change anything. They stop explaining their feelings repeatedly. Because repetition without change slowly drains meaning from communication. And at this stage, emotional investment starts to disappear, not in a dramatic way, not in a visible way, but in a quiet way that replaces emotional effort with emotional distance. Indifference slowly replaces emotional engagement. And this is important to understand. Not caring is not anger. It is emotional shutdown after exhaustion. It is what happens when emotional effort has been given repeatedly without equal return, until the system naturally protects itself by stepping back. And this is where everything ends internally first. Before anything changes externally, the emotional connection has already weakened inside. Because emotional detachment does not begin with actions. It begins with internal disconnection. They no longer react to emotional triggers the same way. Things that once caused emotional disturbance now pass without reaction. Not because they are unaffected, but because their emotional system is no longer investing in the same depth. They no longer seek validation the way they used to. Approval, reassurance, and emotional confirmation lose importance. Not because they don't matter at all, but because they no longer feel reliable as a source of stability. They become calm but distant. And this calmness is often misunderstood. It looks peaceful, but internally it is protective. It is controlled. It is measured. Emotional access is no longer open the way it once was. They are still kind, still respectful, still present in surface interactions. But emotionally, they are no longer fully reachable. They are protecting their inner peace now. And this protection becomes permanent over time, because once emotional detachment becomes stable, it is no longer a reaction. It becomes a state, and once that state is reached, reversal is rare. Not because they cannot return, but because emotional memory does not reset easily. The mind remembers imbalance. It remembers effort that was not matched. It remembers emotional exhaustion that built slowly over time. Trust, once stretched too far, does not return to its original shape easily. Boundaries become permanent. Old emotional patterns no longer feel natural. The empath becomes more selective, more self-protective, more aware of where their emotional energy is going. And once that shift fully settles, the version of them that once overgave, over-explained, and overextended themselves no longer exists in the same way again. In the end, what looks like distance is often misunderstood in the wrong way. It is not revenge. It is not a hidden attempt to punish anyone or make them feel guilty for what happened. It is something much quieter than that. It is emotional exhaustion finally reaching its limit. Because there is only so much a person can give, explain, and adjust before something inside them naturally starts to shut down for protection. Not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Not because they want to hurt anyone, but because continuing the same emotional cycle no longer feels sustainable. And when that limit is reached, clarity begins to take over. Not emotional confusion, not overthinking, but a simple understanding that effort without balance leads nowhere new. So the mind stops chasing explanations that never change outcomes. It stops seeking validation from places that no longer respond with the same emotional depth. And what remains is distance. Not loud, not dramatic, just final in its own quiet way. But the most interesting part is not what happens during this shift. It is what happens after. Because people rarely recognize emotional value while it is still present. They get used to consistency. They normalize understanding. They assume patience will always be available. And only when that emotional presence disappears, when the explanations stop and the availability is no longer there, do they begin to realize what it actually meant. By then, the dynamic has already changed, and what once felt normal suddenly feels irreplaceable. If this video helped you understand the deeper psychology behind emotional attachment and relationships, take a moment to like this video. It helps support the channel and allows more people to discover these insights. And if you want more content like this, that breaks down human behavior, emotional patterns, and relationship psychology in a simple and powerful way, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Mental Dynamics, and join our growing community. Because sometimes, the real value of someone is only understood when their presence turns into silence.